Thank you for joining us today. Today we are going to be talking about podcasting and literacy and how podcasts can support literacy. As you can see, we have a special guest with us. We have Mary Asgo with us. She is our district's instructional coach for writing, and so she's going to be sharing her expertise when it comes to podcasting and literacy. So first, what are podcasts? So podcasts are a series of digital audio files that are made for an audience to listen to. So I know these are kind of like a big hit now. Like they're kind of like the in thing to do is to have podcasts, listen to podcasts, create podcasts. There are many podcasts out there, and as many more apps have been made, but they have the ability to record podcasts. They're making that more accessible, easier to do. And so there's multiple options to choose from if you're wanting to listen to podcasts or if you're wanting to create those digital files to create your own podcasts.
And so why? Why listen to podcasts? Why create them? Why even have them in the classroom at all? Well, one, it sparks creativity in students and in us as teachers. Podcasts are so vast and there's so many different types of podcasts that bringing them in really give your students an authentic experience and an authentic audience, whether you're listening to them or creating them. You're also providing your students with 21st century skills and you're personalizing their learning. If you have students creating podcasts, they can create it for something that they like. They could use some of their background knowledge and whatever's personal to them, and they can now create a podcast using all the skills that you have taught them, but with a subject matter that is personal to them. You can have your students develop literacy and listening skills. You also get authentic engagement. Podcasts are resembling audiobooks where you purposely choose what you want to listen to. Speaking and listening also within podcasts connects to the Common Core state standards. And it's also really, really fun for students, regardless of if they're creating it or listening.
And so we're going to talk about ways that we can use podcasts in the classroom. So maybe one way that you could use it is after they listen to one, you can have them write a summary about it. So now we're working on our listening skills and we're integrating our writing skills as well. Teachers can use it for teaching pronouns and reflexive uses. Podcasts can lead to persuasive speeches. You can use a podcast as a hook for an upcoming topic or a lesson that you're teaching in your classroom. You can have it to look at parts. You can use podcasts and have students look at parts of the podcast, whether it's like the music that is chosen, the intros, if there's any type of comedy, the audience participation, those types of things. And so you can have them discern and look at different parts of it and kind of dissect it and kind of break apart the parts of the podcast and use that and kind of resemble that to like their writing and how they're going to have, different parts of their writing and whatnot. So there's different ways that you can use podcasts in the classroom, not just as a way to just listen, but you can incorporate writing and listening and speaking and those types of things.
So how can podcasts support listening and literacy? There are so many podcasts out there that directly support students listening and literacy, and there are podcasts for every single subject, grade level, even the specific topic that you're covering. Something that I personally did in my classroom is when I was covering different sound waves is I pulled a podcast from NPR, a Listen Wise podcast, where they were talking about different decibels of sound. And they were literally playing sound at different levels. So students really got to interact with what these decibels are and what they are. So here's the sound of a vacuum. Here's the sound of a lawnmower. Here's the sound of a horn honking. So it's all of these personalized learning experiences, but then it's tailored to my curriculum. So I was able to find something that brought the learning of sounds and waves to life for my students. And as students create their own podcasts, they can then start studying tonation, grammar, pausing, oral speaking, reading, communication, all of that within one. Because podcasting and making podcasts is not just about speaking and oral speaking. You're writing, reading, listening, and constantly redoing it and revamping it to make it better.
One of the things, though, that really concerned me about podcasts, and I listen to a lot of them, and my students did too, and they actually created podcasts, was that teaching students the difference between hearing something and just listening to something is super important. So hearing something just means there's sound coming in. There's sound making it to your brain, and it's not conscious. It just happens. You guys might hear a little bit of a train go by at some point, or in your classroom, anything, someone's coughing or somebody sharpening a pencil, just involuntary. Listening, though, is very different. That happens when we start to make meaning of the sound. It's very conscious, and it's super hard to do. So trying to show your students some different types of listening, and there are zillions of types of listening. But as an English teacher, one of the things that got me into figuring out how to teach listening was, well, number one, I was really horrible at it. I thought that listening only had to do with what we call active listening, looking at the people's gestures, their countenances, knowing how to when to respond, those kinds of things. But as English teachers, we always have to, it's part of our curriculum to teach reading, writing, listening, and speaking skills. And I was doing all right with the reading, the writing, and the speaking, but listening, I had no clue. So took me years of research to figure out how to do this, and even then, I don't know that I did it extraordinarily well, but these are some of the things that helped. Teaching my students the difference between what surface level listening was, and that is super selective listening. So it would be, your mom said, clean your room, versus your mom said, we're having pizza for dinner. Selective listening, we're going to hear some of that and some of it we're not. And so listening to speak. So I'm really not listening to you, not really. I'm just listening for my turn. I'm listening for a pause in the conversation so I could jump right in there. Surface level listening is also listening to appease. It's that fake listening that we all do, that listening where like, yeah, I hear you, I'm on my phone, I'm shaking my head, I'm smiling at you, but I'm really on the beach in Santa Cruz, I'm not hearing anything you're saying. And then teaching kids that, well, there's surface listening, but then there's that deep listening, and this is what we want from them, and this is what we want for ourselves. Listening to make sure that we're getting the facts, we're summarizing just information. Listening to make sure we understand the ideas. That is listening to learn. That's the kind of listening we want to happen in the classroom. Listening to appreciate, I think we do pretty well, especially when we're listening to music or we're listening to something that we enjoy learning about. Listening to empathize is a little bit more challenging because you're not just trying to listen to understand, but you're trying to listen to the feeling of things. Does this person have the right tone? Am I feeling what this person's feeling? Rapport listening is also really special and really nice. It's just this idea that I'm going to mimic everything you're saying. If because I'm trying to build a rapport with you, I'm listening for, if you're telling a joke, then I'm making sure that I'm listening to laugh or listening to tell another joke. So if you are using certain language, some people, even if they're deciding that they're going to use high-level vocabulary words versus slang or colloquial terms, I'm listening for those so that I can mirror those terms. You're saying a lot, I'm going to say a lot. Why? Because I want to build rapport with my speaker. Listening to evaluate is an extremely high form of critical thinking. We tend to think of evaluation as judgmental and horrible, but essentially listening to evaluate is the highest form of critical thinking that you can have, because you've got to know summary, you have to understand the ideas, and then you have to be able to take those ideas and ask some really critical questions about them. First of all, is it clear? Did I understand what was just said? Is it accurate? Is this true? Is this relevant at all? Does this have any significance? And so does it have enough depth? Does it have enough breadth? Is the listening complete? And is it fair? Did I listen with an unbiased ear? Did I listen with an open mind? And then can I synthesize all of that to get to a main point and then make some decisions about it, try to solve some problems? So listening to evaluate is what we definitely want to try to get our kids to do in the classroom. And then there's this model of listening called the Hurrier model. And this was developed by a researcher from Cornell University. And so what she argues is that if you listen to hear, understand, remember, interpret, and evaluate, then we can respond effectively. And that's Judy, I think her name is Brunel's work. So a couple of things that can happen before students write their podcasts is the writing. And so what people tend to do in order to get them in the mood of listening is to have a few small talk items. So if your students are writing, if your students are having a podcast about dinosaurs or about whatever the topic is, have them write in a way that includes just some small talk items, that elevator talk. And the whole purpose of that is to get us into the mood of listening. We have to have an intention for it, but we have to even want to listen. So having them write things like, how was your day? Or how are things going? Did you hear about the flyovers that will be happening over Turlock, or in my case, Merced at 1016? Those kinds of small talk items really get us in the mood to even want to listen. And it is, and that's the kind of thing that establishes the rapport. Also being sure that your students are writing the 5 W's and the H. So the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. So if their topic is dinosaurs, making sure that they go through and very completely ask as many questions as they can, particularly questions that they're not necessarily going to use. They want to have more questions than they're going to use for the podcast. Oh, one just flew over Atwater. Thank you. The RENS model is another very good model, not just for writing, but for reading. And so sometimes when in a podcast, there will be lulls. One of the things that helped my students was referring to RENS, asking questions like, what are the reasons that you're saying what you're saying? Or can you give me an example of what you mean? Or the N would be for names. So if they were saying there are lots of things that are happening in Turlock today, well, can you name some of those things? The second N will be numbers. If you say, you know, I have a lot of things that I'm going to be doing today. How many is a lot? Are you going to be doing 5 things, 17 things? And that last S for RENS is super important because those are the 5 senses. So when students are thinking about their listening, the question is, are they listening with the 5 senses? Meaning, can they see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and feel? So are you giving your listeners something to see? You're describing something. Does it have a red, super large apple? Does it smell like whatever you're talking about? Does it smell like burnt toast or burnt popcorn? So you want to try to get the 5 senses in there with those questions. And then making sure that you give yourself listening reminders. You want to have your students to key in on their listening. What am I listening for? Am I listening to appreciate what the speaker is saying? Am I listening to learn from what the speaker is saying? Am I listening to empathize? Am I listening just to evaluate? What exactly am I listening for, and how am I doing that? Am I engaging in enough pauses? Am I summarizing? So how is that happening? So before the podcast, getting your students to write their script will be super important. And it's a little bit time consuming, but it will make the podcast go very, very smoothly. Sitara, Marshall, you guys wanted to add anything at this point before I move to the next? I feel like you've been doing a lot of listening and I've been doing a lot of talking, or should I keep going?
No, I just think, you know, it's something that as simple as just listening to a podcast or creating a podcast, how much writing and listening and speaking skills and standards we can integrate with something as quote unquote basic as just listening to a podcast or creating a podcast. So on the surface, it may look like, oh, you're just creating a podcast. Like, how does that have any type of academic value to it? But when you break it down and you look at how you can easily integrate so much listening and speaking and writing, it holds a lot of academic weight to it, I guess you could say. Is how I'm looking at this, and how like some of the takeaways that I'm getting from this is just, I knew you could integrate those things, but it's just like how much writing and listening and speaking and stuff I can get from my students. And then I just think of how they're going to have to, at least, and Sitara, you and Mary can correct me if it's different on the secondary SBAC exams, but I know for elementary, there's a section where they have to listen to like an article or something, and then they have to answer questions about it. So I just think this is a great way to, practice for that, but then to build those skills so when they are listening to those audio files on the SBAC, they have some type of practice and they've been doing it, so it isn't a brand new kind of concept for them.
That's exactly right. I mean, at the secondary level, at high school, definitely the listening to those 2-minute stories or info research type pieces can be challenging, especially when students are not tuned into how they're listening or what they're listening for. So yes, they're listening to comprehend, but how they're listening means that there could be filters involved. Filters would be things like, oh, someone got up to sharpen a pencil and now my listening has switched to that. Or there's someone mowing the lawn outside the classroom. Now my listening has switched to that. So helping students understand that there are certain filters that happen. So we don't listen well, for example, when we are hungry or we have a headache. And so having students understand those types of things will impact your listening. We don't listen well when we have emotional upheavals. Maybe, my dog just died, or I broke up with my girlfriend, or I performed badly in the soccer game the night before. So that internal listening, we're listening to ourselves instead of listening to what the person is reading to us on SBAC. So it's really important to open up the pedagogy to students and explain exactly how listening works, to unpeel that. Sitara, did you want to add anything?
Yes, and I wanted, and this isn't just like a skill that you'll do in one day, because podcasting can take months. It can be a year-long project. So it's something that you're constantly going back and reinforcing. And it's not just an English thing. It's not just for our ELA teachers to focus on, or only for elementary, because you guys are amazing and you teach all of the subjects. But it's something that in the secondary level, me as a science teacher, I've used this in my classroom. I didn't make podcasts, but I had my students listen to it and connect it. And with so many different podcasts out there, there's podcasts for history and science, and then any single topic that you want, you can find a podcast for that. And then to take it and dissect the podcast you're listening to first, and then to look at all those features and say, okay, now let's create one. Then kids are being creative, they're communicating, they're collaborating, and you're sparking the interest to them, and they're writing and reading and listening and working on these skills that, as a science teacher, I didn't know to teach them about these different listening skills, passive listening and active listening. And I didn't know about it. And it's like, oh, I wish I could go back in time and reteach those kids that I had with these new skills that I now have in front of me. but we can't. I don't have a time machine, but it's now something that I can go forward with and be like, okay, this is what I've learned. How can I then transfer this knowledge to my students? That way they're better listeners, and they're better listeners for me in my class. When I talk to them later, they're better listeners at home. They'll be better listeners in their jobs, in their future families. So it's not something that's just classroom restricted. I feel like everything that you've been saying, I'm like applying it to other things too.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's something so expansive and amazing that something as simple, I say it in quotes, something as simple as making a podcast. And I know Marshall can attest to how much it goes into making a podcast with the scripting, but how much that podcast making and applying and progressively using it over a course of time and getting better at it can apply itself in so many different facets in your life and in the future.
Definitely so. Definitely so. During the podcast, some note taking could be happening, but which kids are doing anyway. They're doing the note taking in class. But I've had students who didn't focus on keywords or phrases when they were note taking. They just focused on capturing everything. And so this idea of the keywords with a podcast, it's particularly compelling, and it's particularly good to teach, to focus on key words when they're listening to a podcast. That way they can get those main ideas out there, key phrases, and they can tune into things that they might want to follow up on. And so writing keywords or key phrases, or just doodling. Sometimes when I listen in lectures, or if I'm listening during a podcast, I'm making little stick figures to remind me of things that I want to talk about later, or things that have come up. Also, it's really important to make those affirming sounds during the podcast. And so that, of course, portends that we're not listening to an audience that we can see. So if we can't see them, we're doing the yes, those kinds of affirming sounds. And of course, if we're listening to someone and that we can see, we all tell them, be active listeners, give the affirmative shaking of the head and those kinds of things. But affirming sounds during a podcast, particularly if they're interviewing people, will be very, very helpful. And as usual, moving forward with follow-up questions. What I found when my students were making their podcasts is that they weren't very good at following up with questions. They would just move on to the next question. And so if, like Sitara said, if we're likening this skill to what we would be doing in a classroom, it's the same thing. The teacher is giving a mini lecture about something. It's important, as the student is listening, to jot down a question and then ask that question, and that will move the conversation forward, and it will definitely be a help in terms of understanding. And then, of course, keeping the Hurrier model in mind, making sure that we hear and understand things, and that we are definitely looking at how much of this are we actually able to understand just based on what we remembering, and having a sole focus is super important in the lectures in the classroom, but definitely during a podcast, having to focus and focusing on the images does really help. And then interpreting, being able to stay within the context of the message and avoiding those biases so that we can make meaning. And then lastly, evaluating, making sure that we can keep an open mind, we're not jumping to conclusions, and we're definitely asking questions. So that Hurrier model might be, I found it to be at least one of the most helpful things that I used with my students. So summing it all up, afterwards, after the podcast, it's important for students to reflect on their listening. So what we always did, and this was during discussions mostly, with our ERWC curriculum with my seniors, that's a curriculum where you're teaching controversial issues, emotions run high, people get upset, and we had senior seminar every Friday. And so it was really important to have a listening partner. So in my classroom, I had students who would say, here's what I want you to listen for in seminar today. So I would go to my listening partner and say, it's my turn to engage in seminar. There'd be a small circle in the front of the room, maybe 12 or 15 students, and the rest of the class would be listening, and they'd have listening partners. So one question would be, I want you as my listening partner to see whether or not I am listening for empathy. Am I listening? Have I taken all of my biases off the table? Am I listening solely to understand what this person is saying and what this person is feeling? How did I do? How good was I listening today? 1 to 5. And I gave them a little listening rubric, and the listening partner would then debrief after the discussion. And so it's important to have them reflect on the podcast afterwards. And then also reflect on, what were the filters? Was I cold? Was I hungry? Was I thinking about something else? Was I emotionally and mentally detached because of something physically happening in the room, or because of something that was happening internal with me? Maybe I'm listening to my own brain noise. Or is it physiological? Am I just, am I in a state of, I really need a drink of water? And then also, did I use RENs? Did I ask enough reasons, examples, names, numbers, 5 senses in order to help my speaker? So if I'm in a discussion, am I doing that? Anything you guys want to add to this one in terms of reflecting on the listening?
It really, like for me, for secondary, like connect it as much as you can to your essential standards, to what you're covering. Make sure that the podcast that you're either creating or that you're listening to go along with your topic, and then have your students connect what they listen to whatever it is that you're teaching. So keep bringing it back to your standards, keep bringing it back to like the sole purpose of it, so you can expand what you're learning about with all these podcasts and creating it and reflecting on themselves. So if they're creating it and they're reflecting on themselves, then the next podcast that they create, the next episode, they're going to keep increasing their skills and keep getting better. Or if they're just listening to a podcast, then they just reflect back, okay, well, what did I learn? How does it apply to this overarching goal? This was the whole, like, what was that big wondering, that big question that we were going for? How does this relate to that? So keep going back to it. Keep going back to that big question that you're answering, that all of this was for.
Yeah, no, I agree. Doing podcasts, listening to podcasts, creating them is fun, but making sure that we're always bringing it back to those standards and connecting it to the content that we're covering in our classroom, so then our students can make those connections as well.
And, a lot of this is about cognition, teaching students metacognitive ways to do an internal checkup on their listening. And Julian Treasure has a really great acronym here that I love. He calls it RASA, and that is, he said, it's a Sanskrit term for the essence of things, and so of the juice, or the real heart, the essence of it. And so he said, in order to improve the listening, you have to do rasa, to receive, really pay attention, really, really focus, and try to weed out the filters as much as possible, and then to appreciate. That goes back to that affirmative shaking of the head, or that yes, I get it, those affirmative sounds that we make, so students know they're being heard. And then to summarize, so what you meant was, or so what I heard you say was, so I think what you're saying is, to just constantly summarize at different points during the listening, and asking those follow-up questions. And of course, the Hurrier model. So if we can teach students to improve their listening skills during podcasting, those same skills, as Sitara and Marshall were saying, apply to our standards, and they apply to just everyday teaching. So when they're listening to us lecture, we're given our little 5 to 7 minute mini lecture, we might even want to stop and say, okay, I have something really important I want to say. So frame it that way. So that way, they are going to get off the beach in Santa Cruz and they're going to come back to the classroom and then they're going to listen. I have something important to say. I would like you right now in 30 seconds to write down a summary, or to write down things that I just said in my little lecture that you appreciated, or to write down things that you particularly paid attention to in the lecture, or to write down a follow-up question, but just to follow Rasa and the Hurrier model, and just real quick checks for understanding so that they can be in tune with the metacognition of their own listening. So they're not just thinking about how they're thinking, but they're thinking about how they're listening. Those are some really great resources that have helped me over the years and that have continued to help me. And some of these folks do have podcasts, and they do actually have TED Talks. Julian Treasure is a listening expert, and that How to Be Heard book is fantastic. And I would highly recommend anything by Eric Palmer. Teaching the core skills of listening and speaking has just been a gold mine for me. And then definitely using Judy Brunel's work, that listening Hurrier model.
And then we'll go through and we'll link to all these resources so you guys have you guys can check them out at your leisure. So they'll be in like the description and in the show notes and stuff as well. Okay, so we've kind of hit on this, but we're just going to kind of reiterate. So what can podcasts do? Podcasts can give you a voice. So they can, you can have your students be doing podcasts, and maybe that student in your class that you never hear from, that never wants to talk, never wants to share out, now you've given them a platform. You've given them a voice to share their thinking, share things that are important to them, share how they're connecting to the content that you're teaching in your class. It's going to inspire some students. So some students may not, as much as we may not want to admit it, they might not get very inspired to sit there and have to read an essay and then answer questions about it. But if you are asking them to create their own, and you're asking them to listen to one, maybe that kind of triggers something in them. It's going to inform them. It's going to educate them. And then it's going to make them laugh. It's going to allow them to tell a story or allow them to listen to a story. It can make you cry. And like I said, it's going to provide a platform for them. So some of those students that we have in our class, this might be the avenue, and this might be the platform they need to kind of show their listening, or show their understanding, show their knowledge, and be able to share that with you and with their classmates.
Definitely. And then all of these images you see here, they're all linked. So if you were to click them on your copy of the slides, it'll take you to the actual podcast. So these are just some examples. This is definitely not all encompassing. These are just some examples of different podcasts that some elementary teachers have used. And this was taken from Tom Covington, a podcasting 101 session that I attended during Fall Q. And these are just some really great podcasting stations that you can look at, but definitely make sure you still preview anything that you're going to show your kids. Listen to it beforehand and try to do things in small chunks. Don't have your students listen to 30 minutes of a podcast. Do 5 minutes or less. Always 5 minutes or less, because usually after a couple of minutes, that's where those listening skills really need to be retaught. And you need to show your students, okay, well, if your mind wandered, what could we do? Talk about those skills of how we can refocus, how, you just heard the AC kick on and those things are loud and you're in the back of the room, speakers in the front. So what can we constantly do to refocus ourselves, to work on those listening skills? That way we're hearing and listening at the same time.
And then, if you think about it too, your listening is kind of like a muscle. You have to train it. So if you don't want to start off hey, we're going to listen to a 30-minute podcast, because they're not going to listen for 30 minutes. So like Sitara said, start small, start with a couple minutes, and then gradually work your way up to longer segments. So you don't want to start off with like a, like I said, like a long 30-minute segment. Start them off small, get them trained, get their muscle ready for it, and then you can start expanding.
Oh yeah.
Yes, the brain will wander.
Yep.
Yes. Just treat them the same way as us as adults. I'm not going to sit there and listen to a 30-minute podcast that I didn't care about in the beginning. If you don't get me to buy in, you don't tell me a why, you don't connect with how this applies personally to me, you've lost me from the start. And then you're telling me that I have to sit there for almost an hour listening.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely get that buy-in, get that why, and just start small. Start small and then slowly increase it to build their capacity of listening.
So these are examples that we could use with our elementary students. We're also going to share here are some examples of ones that could be used with middle school students. And then these also came from Ton Covington's presentation at Fall Q. And then here's some ones that could be used with high school students. So again, with all of these are just some recommendations. There's tons more out there that you can find, but like Sitara and I mentioned before, make sure before you pick an episode that you're going to share with your class, preview it, make sure that it's covering what you want. The title of the episode might not necessarily connect with the content that you're teaching in your classroom, and we just want to make sure that the content that's being covered is appropriate and that it's going to connect with what you're teaching in your classroom.
And then there's also podcasts for professional development. I listen to podcasts when I drive to work, and I don't get to listen to the whole thing, but 10 minutes every time I'm in the car. And I slowly throughout the week will be able to listen to one podcast just for myself, just for a little bit of professional development when I'm just driving in the car in the morning or right after work. And I learned so much from just listening to someone's conversation. And I also learn a lot about myself and what interests me and what I gravitate towards when I'm just listening. So here are some examples of different podcasts that you can listen to for professional development, but there's so many more out there. So definitely you can look through your apps on your phone, you can go online and you can search for just different podcasts that just kind of pique your interest. You can even search for a topic and put podcasts after it in the Google search bar and results will come up. So it's a really nice way to learn and also to learn from others and grow your professional network as well.
Yep, exactly. And then there is a educational podcasting directory that is linked on this slide. So if you click on where it says educational podcast directory, it'll take you to a site that has a bunch of, it's a directory. So if you are searching for a particular topic, it's going to kind of filter through and it's going to show you some podcasts that will cover that specific topic. And then shameless plug here. I have my own that I do that I just kind of talk about some ed tech things. So that is one that if you were interested in, that you could listen to as well.
And then how do we do this in the classroom? So Mary talked about this in great deal of the planning and the recording and kind of the afterwards. But so you have to have the kids plan. You can't just sit them in front of the Chromebook and be like, all right, open up, beautiful audio editor or Vocaroo that we're going to go over later and start recording. They have to have a plan. It has to be written down. They have to have a script. You want them to have those questions that Mary talked about. She said they need to have these questions. They need to have follow-up questions. Think about that end goal. If you're going to have your students create a podcast about persuasive writing, have them write and have them conduct a persuasive podcast where they're writing and they're persuading someone to do something that connects with them personally. It doesn't have to be centered on a specific topic if you're teaching them an overall goal. Or if you're having them talk about, for example, I'm a science teacher, so I always revert to this. If they're doing a physics topic or something on the Newton's laws or magnetism or electricity, have them talk about it, but have them plan out what they're going to say. Because you don't want to have your students sit there in front of the computer and just say the entire time. Because that's something that we teach them not to do with oral speaking as well. and then record, and then re-record. So we've got those arrows going in a circle because they're going to listen to themselves and they're going to re-record it. Just when they take a picture of themselves, or when we take a picture of ourselves, we see it, we analyze it, we delete it, we redo it. Our students are going to be doing the same thing.
Well,
And then,
can I speak to just one issue about the planning? When your students are planning, it's very, very important to have them do that old teacher model that we have when we're planning, our into, our through, and our beyond. So, or just, I'm an English teacher, so I'm thinking in terms of essay writing. What is my introduction? What is the body? And what is the conclusion? So my intro planning, what are those initial, maybe soft kinds of questions that I want to think about? The essential questions that are going to lead me to the more specific questions in the body, and then the end. How am I going to end the podcast? So how am I going to start it? What are my main topics? And then what's the middle going to look like? How many questions are there? Where do I want to go with those? And then how are we going to end the podcast? So making sure that they start off with an overarching question of, what do I want to accomplish? How am I getting, what do I need to get from this? Or what do I want my listeners to get from this? And then take them into, through, and then beyond that. And those follow-up questions will definitely will be helpful.
Perfect. I love that. And then this could be something that can take one podcast, or it can be multiple. They can start with a question and then they're just trying to figure out what the answer is. And then they progressively figure out the answer through all the extra research and extra work that they're extrapolating in the class. And then they're putting that in subsequent podcast episodes where the entire podcast is about an overall thing, an overall topic, an overall wondering, an overall question that they're making all of these short podcasts all about. And these podcast episodes that your students are making, they're not 30 minutes either. They're a few minutes. And you'll see that for a 2-minute podcast, they're going to have 3 to 5 pieces of paper on what they're writing and what they're scripting.
And on looking at this graphic too, like, so they're doing their planning and recording. They're going to go through edit, and then they're going to share it. And because it says shared, that does not mean that it needs to be shared publicly to the world. This could be sharing is you're posting it in your Google Classroom, something like that. Something is simple. You don't have to think that, okay, I need to go through this big old ordeal, this big old process where I'm like creating this public podcast. It can literally be something that is posted into Google Classroom that your students listen to. And it can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be anything more than that.
This same slide that Marshall just talked about and Sitara just talked about with regard to planning, recording, editing, and sharing, that is the writing process in and of itself.
Yep.
Planning, are we brainstorming? Recording, we're actually doing some writing, some drafting, we're getting it out there. Editing, that's where the revision happens, and we're fine-tuning, revising, and then finally that sharing piece is so important. Even if you're just sharing it with one other partner, going public with the writing, you know you're going to be sharing it with your teacher, but going public with the writing, sharing is super important. So those are the steps in the writing process.
Yep, exactly.
Help the students to see that it's the same
thing.
Definitely.
Okay, so now we're talking about all this stuff, and then you're like, okay, so what can I use to create it? So we have a couple of apps that are pending right now, but they are going to be approved. And one of them is Vocaroo. It is a website that you go to, and it's literally just a simple editor. You go to this site, you click record, you record what you're going to say, and then it downloads that audio file for you.
I'm glad to see it's still around.
Yes. And then another one that's going to give you a little bit more control over things is Beautiful Audio Editor. So that is something that you can record and edit the audio in. And then this is nice because it's connected to your Google Drive. So it'll save those files in your Google Drive or your student's Google Drive for them. So both of these are going to be good for teachers and students to use. And then if you have an iOS device, so if you're a teacher that has like an iPad or something, there is also GarageBand that you can record and edit audio files with. So these are 3 options that we could use to record and edit audio files.
And definitely, like, don't be afraid to use these in your class with your students. You might not know how to use them, and they might not know how to use them, but put it in front of them and tell them to figure it out,
Hmm.
because they will. Our students have no fear when it comes to clicking buttons. And when they ask you questions, and you don't know the answer to, they have a computer. And I would always say the same thing. And then my students started quoting it to themselves. So I know said it enough times. I'd say you have the world at your fingertips. Why are you asking me?
I think I started using the Vocaroo, and I just don't know if it's still, if it saves, because when I was using it back in the early 2000s, it wouldn't save anything. Does it save?
I believe it does now. Yeah.
Oh, good. They've improved.
Yes.
You just have to download it.
Yep.
So it won't save it on the site itself. Once you record it, you have to download it. And then students that are on their Chromebook devices, they would download it and then upload it right to their drive, because
Wow.
it would be there.
The tech keeps moving.
Yes, it is. All right. And so we wanted to, because we know that this was a question that was going to come up. So can students use mobile devices and apps to record? Because every student or not every student, every person that has a smartphone, it has a voice recorder on there. So you could use that, but we just urge you to use caution when allowing students to use their personal devices. Apps like Anchor and other things to record audio, they might have those on their phones, but that's their personal device, and there's little protection that we can provide when students are using their personal devices. So it might be something that you're like, hey, whip out your phone, record it on your phone or whatever, but we just urge you to kind of use caution when you're allowing students to use their personal devices, just because it is their personal device. So there's little protection that we can provide them when they're using their personal devices. So again, we just want to thank you guys for joining us today. Tomorrow we are going to be talking about HyperDocs and ways that we can integrate those into our classrooms, both in a distance learning environment, but also when we get back to our brick and mortar classroom. So that'll be tomorrow, 10 o'clock. And so go ahead and please join us as we cover HyperDocs tomorrow. So now we are going to transition into the Q&A section of our webinar. All right, so there are a couple questions in the Q&A, and then I'm sure there's some in the chat as well. So the first one in the Q&A, it says, what are some of your favorite resources for finding podcasts that you can use in class for a specific topic you want to teach? Go ahead.
So what I found, like, certain podcast stations that I just liked as a teacher myself, like ListenWise through NPR. I liked them just because they always gave me two sides of everything. And as a science teacher, I always told my students, you need to look at all the evidence in front of you. So I always stuck to that. And then I just searched what I wanted. Or if I heard something from NPR, I would email them and they would send me like a little recording snippet of what I wanted, which is awesome that they do that.
Awesome.
Yeah. Now that they have ListenWise, like, they keep, like, they say, well, try to find it here. And then you have to keep telling them that you tried. But I also just went to Google. I said, podcasts about this or podcasts about that. I also was in a lot of Facebook teacher groups, and I sometimes would just look up things on Pinterest, and sometimes I would come across a podcast topic that I didn't even think about was a thing. So just search, look for things. Definitely check out the resources that we linked to for whatever grade level you're thinking of. I know history, there's amazing podcasts for history, and I hear it from history teachers all the time that they just love listening to it even on their free time. So that's definitely something that I personally want to check out just for myself. But what about you, Marshall?
No, like if I'm searching for something, I kind of just do a search. Like I just go on Google. I'm like, hey, I want to see if there's a podcast about this particular thing. And then I probably am not the most efficient at searching, because if I'm just going to Google, it's going to give me a wide range of things. But that's kind of how, when I've used it, that's kind of what I've done. Or I've gone through like my podcast app that I use, and I like search for stuff in there is kind of how I go about it. So another question was, can we assign a podcast through Google Classroom or quizzes and have students note their learning / answer questions? Google Classroom, I would say yes. Quizzes, I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that to see if that's something that you can do. But then to kind of piggyback on the next question, so then there's the follow-up question was, can students listen to podcasts on their Chromebooks, or do they need to download an app? So most podcasts have a website that you can, or like a web interface that you can go to. So they don't necessarily have to download an app to listen to it. You can just send them a link to the web portion of that podcast, and then they can just pull it up there. So it should work on their Chromebooks.
The only caveat I have with that, just like from a secondary perspective, is my students love to click.
Yeah.
So if I were to send them a link, they would click and listen to anything, because you're sending them a link to a specific podcast, but that doesn't hide all the other ones. So yes, that one was appropriate because I listened to it, but there could be 20 others that they now see and they could click. Or because all those other ones aren't appropriate, that site could be blocked.
True.
So what I always did as a teacher was I played it, because then I wanted to teach them these listening skills first and foremost. And I wanted to kind of, I guess, facilitate the listening process myself. But definitely for distance learning, you could share it, you could facilitate it, you can have things going with it. You could even have the podcast playing on your computer and use like Screencastify or Vocaroo and record it. That way you're only getting a certain chunk. Let's say the podcast is 10 minutes long and you only want 2 minutes. Have it playing in the background and use Vocaroo or Screencastify and talk about it beforehand. Have them listen to it and give them some questions and some thoughts to think about afterwards. That way it's all kind of protected for them, because I fear that with our students and what they could access and listen to, like I don't want them to kind of listen to something that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, no, I agree. I like that.
Just to add on to that, I was just thinking in terms of teachers, we generally want to give students questions, which, we should be doing that. But also having students generate their own questions beforehand would be really awesome as well. Because when students generate their own questions, they're listening for those answers. So the listening becomes purposeful, it becomes intentional. Because now they're things they want to know.
Right.
I like that.
That's a good idea, because then you can even have them collaborate in a group, and then they're coming up with these questions together. And then afterwards, they had these questions that weren't answered. Now what? Well, now we got to figure out the answers to them. So then that even leads to a deeper dive within it. And what was that podcast about? Well, I don't know. Why didn't you know? Well, because I was only specifically listening to these questions that weren't answered. Okay, well, let's re-listen and let's figure it out. And then I like that, because it just opens up to so many more possibilities of how to teach listening and writing and that overarching topic. Like if you're talking about electricity and electrons and how it even gets started, or magnetism, or the core, or the Roman Empire, or American history, or the revolution, there's so many things out there that they could just gravitate to.
I like how you said re-listening. So that speaks to that part of what Marshall was saying when he said fine tune and edit. Well, you got your questions that maybe your teacher gave you that you're listening for, but then when you develop your own, that's when the fine tuning really, really starts.
And then I just think they come up with their questions beforehand. Like Sitara said, some questions get answered, some don't. So now that you can now segue into research, and so now let's go through, let's research as a group, let's figure out what are appropriate ways to research this topic, and then you can get into appropriate and sites, and this is a credible site, this is sources, thank you, this is a credible source, this isn't, this is that type of stuff. So it's starting off as something simple as you're creating your own questions before listening to a podcast, and now it has bloomed and developed into this greater kind of project that they're working on, all because you just asked them to jot down some questions they had before they listened to a 2-minute segment of a podcast.
Yeah, I love it.
It's beautiful.
That's it's learning. It's differentiated.
Yeah.
It's scaffolded. It's facilitated. It's student-centered. It's interactive. It's everything that learning should be.
Yes. Okay. So we answered all of the questions in the Q&A. I'm
And-
looking to see if there's anything in.
There was one question, but then we answered it
Okay.
because they said the question was answered. Thanks. So the question that was in the chat said, is there a resource to find a podcast for a specific topic that you want to teach in class? And then what we had gone over was you can start with those podcasts that we shared, or you can even just simply just Google it and see what comes up, or go on different Facebook groups or Twitter or Pinterest and see what you can find.
Yep. Okay. Are there any other questions that anybody has for us? Yes, I agree with you 100%, Rick. These skills go way beyond the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking, man, if I would have done this in my classroom, I probably wouldn't have, if I would have focused more on listening skills, I probably wouldn't have to repeat my directions 10 times.
Yes. Yes. Like, I read it to you. I read it on the board. It's on the projector. You have a copy of it, and you're still asking me what we need to do.
Yes.
So
You're
here's
like,
the
I have
question.
failed you. Yeah.
The
Like, I
question is-
failed.
So what kind of listening are you doing today? So get that listening partner. That was one of the most helpful things I think we were able to establish, especially during the very difficult curriculum of ERWC, controversial issues like juvenile justice and talking about issues of race and those really hard topics. And so having a listening partner was super helpful for my students, because one thing was that they didn't always hear what they were saying because they didn't set an intention for how they were going to start listening in the first place. And the other beautiful thing that we did was we made sure that there was a balance between speaking and silence, because in order for listening to happen, there has to be some modicum of silence or quiet. And when silence happens, that's when you have time to think.
That's true.
All right. Like always, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to email us and we will get back to you. We're here to support you. We just want to thank you again, Mary, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you for
Mary.
having me. This was fun.
Yes. All right. Thank you guys, and we will talk to you next time.
Bye.